Hey, Energy Rant people. Um, this week we're going to be doing a video blog. I'm going to be following up on the Grid Interactive Building, Efficient Building series that we've been that have been writing and reading the last few weeks. Just to recap, the first thing we looked at was an introduction to Grid Interactive Buildings. You know, what's it all for? So basically, it's using buildings as batteries. It's a lot more complicated than that. To serve as grid resources to help the demand match supply. The second thing we looked at was how complex it's going to be. I said we'll use buildings as batteries, but it's more complicated than that, a lot more complicated than that. It's difficult to use buildings as grid resources other than beyond what is normally energy efficiency. The third thing we looked at was customer perspectives at Grid Interactive Buildings. What's in it for them? Why would they want to do it as an individual? As we know, it's hard to get people to do things for the betterment of society, but they'll do things that are better for themselves. So it's, you know, what's in it for them. Last week we looked at utility perspectives, and you know, I wrote about, you know, utilities make money by building stuff and financing it with rate base and you know, return on investment over a long period of time. And so why would they want to do Grid Interactive Buildings? So that brings us to this week, which is performance-based rate making. And so, which I see as a key component of Grid Interactive Buildings, because it has to be something in it for utilities and for customers, everybody, to make this work. And in the last week, I saw a PBR, performance-based rate making webinar that featured Doug Scott with Great Plains Institute. And I thought, wow, this is a great resource to bring in and talk about to move to this next step in Grid Interactive Buildings. So in a minute or two, we're going to be talking with Doug, and I've got a bunch of questions for him, and it's going to be a great discussion. Most simply, you know, I've described Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings as basically like a big, you know, a big battery that's available for the grid, whether it's shaping, shifting, or shaving loads to match the supply side. And so I'm going down the steps of the DOE's road. What's it called? Roadmap. And so I'm to the point now where it's like sooner or later we're gonna end up with rates and rate making, I think, to make Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings cost effective both for customers and for the utilities. And so this the WebEx that, or the webinar that you know, we watched, I think it was a week ago, that you were on with AESP was really good and piqued my interest with this performance-based rate making.
Thanks.
Did they call it PBRs or PBR?
Either performance-based rate making or performance incentive mechanisms. They kind of get used interchangeably.
Okay, so I'll spell it out. Performance-based rate making. So could you give us you know, some examples of where it's being deployed and how performance-based rate making works, just in general? And we have some other specific questions on that, Doug.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, you know, the main thing to do is kind of start at the beginning, which is, you know, the rate making traditionally has been, you know, cost of service rate making, or what's kind of called the build more, sell more. And it was done because the idea was to try to get as much electricity out to as many parts of the country as you could. And so the incentive was for the utilities to build more generation, more distribution, more transmission, get it out to as many people as they possibly could. And their incentive then was to be able to sell more electricity. And that served us very well for a long period of time in terms of electrifying the country and making sure people had access to electricity. Well, times have changed a bit or a lot. New technology, a lot more distributed energy resources now. A lot of people putting solar on their homes or wanting to be part of a community solar or looking at microgrids. There's a lot. It's just different than the system was. And so the question becomes, well, what are some ways that we can try to align utility behavior to other goals that a particular jurisdiction might have? That could be decarbonization. That could be trying to incent people to do more distributed generation. So just whatever the goals happen to be, the idea of trying to make sure that our rate making is incentivizing the right behavior on the part of utilities. Things like reliability, keeping costs down, customer service, those are always things that no matter what the rest of the system is going to be like, are things that are goals that states or commissions or jurisdictions have. But now you're seeing trying to align some of the other goals that they might have, like decarbonization, for example. And so things like performance-based rate making then becomes more of a thing, because instead of just saying, well, the incentive is just for the utility to build as many things as they can in terms of their distribution network, and to sell as much electricity as they can. Let's try to figure out some ways that we can incentivize the utility to do things that are not just based on building more and selling more. And so that's kind of where it came about. And so you've seen versions of this in lots of different places. So you've seen versions in, a state like Hawaii, which is going to, almost, looking at a system of almost everything is based on performance, or New York looking at that and they're reforming the energy vision, the same kind of thing. The District of Columbia, Rhode Island, there's a number of jurisdictions that have done that. We've worked specifically on projects in Minnesota and in Illinois, working on this. And so performance-based rate making is not one size fits all. Different jurisdictions will use it to do different things. The size and scope of it will be different. But I think it has a lot of really good potential going forward to try to do things that a lot of us would like to see with the energy system, on top of the things that we all value, which are reliability, affordability, and customer service.
Yeah.
So that was long-winded. I apologize for that, but
that's
kind of the context that we start from.
Yeah, it reminds me of the benefit cost testing model. So it's like begin with the objectives in mind, and then work toward them. And that's kind of I'm glad you described where we've been. And I remember now that I hear you say that again, I remember that from the ASP webinar, that how did we get here? We want to get electricity to as many customers as possible. Keep building, keep growing 7% a year, and keep adding to the rate base. And so that's kind of where I ended up in this series of blogs. What's in it for utilities was last week, and this week, this is why I'm interviewing you for performance-based rate making, to see, how do we make this work and more profitable for utilities. So you mentioned some of the performance-based mechanisms very briefly, and I picked up on some of those in the ASP webinar, and I picked up the ones from Hawaii that you mentioned. They included distributed energy resources, deployments, whether they're batteries. They didn't mention generators. Maybe demand response. They had some interconnection metrics.
Yep.
Maybe how many devices were connected to the grid. What are some other performance-based metrics that you've seen employed with performance-based rate making?
Well, a lot of them have to do with reliability and some of the affordability and customer service ones. So those are ones people kind of start with. So whereas that's always the goal, being able to try to incent the utility to do even better in terms of reliability is something. And when we say performance-based rate making, it can come with a benefit to the utility, but it can also come with a penalty, and they don't necessarily both have to be there. So in Illinois, for example, they 10 years ago put in some reliability measures, and if the utilities don't hit them, there's a penalty for not hitting them. There's no upside. So they they can only lose money if they don't hit certain goals. In other places, you'll see what they call symmetry, which is utility has the ability to kind of over earn if they do exceptionally well on a particular benchmark, or they have the ability to lose money if they don't perform well on that benchmark. So those are the, that's the reliability is one where you always see you've started to see some things in terms of customer service over the years. So that's been things like, well, where do you stand on kind of the national organizations that rate customer satisfaction? So JD Power survey is the one that you see happen a lot. So where do you come in on that? Or you see other ones that are very specific. How many customer service calls are resolved in the first call? How long does it take you to answer the phone when a customer calls in on a customer service hotline? You can see metrics that get as specific as things like that, or as general as, what's the basic feeling of the utility, by customers. And then you see some affordability measures that are there as well, making sure that the utility performs everything they need to, but if they perform that in a way that saves customers money, maybe there's the ability for the utility to share in that. Or if they don't do that, to be penalized for that. So those are kind of the ones that you tend to see in almost any performance-based rate making framework. You tend to see the affordability and especially the reliability and customer service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm generally in favor of the. I can't remember what the term you used, but I wrote down carrots and sticks. So it's I like having both ways. So it's not just penalties, because I know there's some states that have, like for energy efficiency, the business that we're in, some states have penalties if they don't meet their goal, and penalties only. They don't, there's no upside for exceeding goals, and I don't think that's right. I'm a believer in everybody wins. That's got to benefit everybody, and if all one party has is a chance to lose money, I don't think that's a good way to go about it.
Energy efficiency is an interesting one, because a lot of states have energy efficiency programs that they've developed on their own, separate from a performance-based rate making model. And energy efficiency is interesting because it's totally antithetical to what the traditional model has been for the utilities, which is to sell more electricity. That's how you got paid. So putting in programs that will compensate the utilities for doing things like energy efficiency programs, and there's different structures for them. Some of them will pay for the costs that the utility incurs for doing an energy efficiency program. Some of them will reward energy efficiency programs that meet a certain cost benefit threshold. What that led to, and that's the way most of them were set up, but what that led to was kind of grabbing low-hanging fruit. So you saw a lot of light bulb programs because it always met the cost benefit analysis.
Looking at one of those right now.
What some people have been thinking about now is, well, can we change that dynamic a little bit and go after some of the things that might have a much bigger payoff, but maybe a little bit iffier, up front in terms of being able to know you're going to have that. So either pay the utility, which is something Illinois did in a bill 5 years ago, started paying the utilities for their energy efficiency costs, regardless, once a program got approved, then they were going to be compensated for their costs. So they weren't always going after just the things that they knew were the sure winners. Because I think the feeling is you're leaving a lot of energy efficiency on the table. And then, people will say sometimes, well, energy efficiency ends up costing the ratepayers up front, and it does, but you're doing that based on what you think are going to be the benefits to the system going forward. And if you're right about that, and if there are the benefits from an energy efficiency program, that's, in terms of a clean energy program, that's going to be much cheaper than anything else that you can do. That's going to be much cheaper than building new renewables or doing other, interconnection that you might do. If you hit on the energy efficiency programs from a clean energy standpoint, that's the cheapest way almost always that you can go. And so people are kind of rethinking how they're doing that. And so you'll see things like, well, if you can hit all these goals, but you're using this much less energy, that's going to have a benefit to the customers, but then also maybe we should have some shared savings for the utility to reward them for making that move, and something that's not necessarily, pursuant to their own business model, because they're taking money out of their own pocket if they're selling less electricity.
Yeah. So performance-based rate making then is really shifting the business model. Then
Yeah.
is generally what we're talking about.
Yeah, it is.
Right.
It is to better align utility performance with state goals.
Yep. So you led right up to my next question, which was energy efficiency, and you said so to deploy energy efficiency, costs money, and so that money gets added on to rates that customers are paying, and so I use the simple explanation of it's kind of like my gasoline price is $3.25 a gallon, but the energy efficiency cost me 25 cents a gallon. So now I'm paying $3.50 rather than $3.25, but I'm getting 40 miles per gallon rather than 30 miles per gallon. So I'm ahead since I participated, but not every customer participates. So how?
And that's a great analogy.
So
except that the other drivers who aren't paying for the gas, and if we're extending the analogy, they benefit too in energy efficiency, because if there's enough people on that are reducing their energy consumption, and especially if they're doing it at peak times, at peak demand times, not having to run peak generators, you're not having to purchase power on the spot market from other places, that has benefits for everybody in the system, whether they're participating in the energy efficiency program or not. So if you're lowering the total cost of what it costs to generate electricity for this jurisdiction at this particular time, I benefit from that if I'm in that jurisdiction, whether or not I'm part of the EE program or not. So the analogy works, it just only works so far.
Yeah, right. Beautiful point. But as you started to explain that, I was just thinking about even in that analogy, you're reducing the demand for energy. That's going to lower cost with
right, which should
supply,
yeah,
simple supply demand.
But then we got to get into OPEC and everything, and I don't necessarily want to do that. So,
so it is possible. I mean, that's the crux of what I'm driving at here is it is possible to use performance-based rate making to reduce or incentivize reducing prices, basically.
Yeah, where you'll see that come up. Prices. Yeah, and where you'll see that come up a lot in PBR frameworks is in shifting demand, but not shifting just for shifting sake, shifting it to periods where either the energy mix is cleaner. So if we know that if we shift demand to nighttime hours, where on our particular system, it's nuclear power and wind, and a part of our goal is to get a cleaner energy, mix, then that may be worth it to try to shift people to that particular time. And we can do that either with demand response kind of programs, time of use rates, critical peak pricing periods. There's lots of different ways people can do that. Or you can do it you could put the onus on the utility and say, let's develop a performance metric that talks about the percentage of shift away from peak loads, for example, and drive it that way and allow them to come up with the programs that are going to help achieve that.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds like a good future for us. So,
yeah, and utilities are getting more sophisticated about it. For example, there's a utility in the Midwest that we know that offers a program for electric vehicle charging. And a lot of times you'll see electric vehicle charging pricing programs will be, well, we know our peak is, say, 3 to 7 p.m.
Yep.
So if you charge after that, we'll give you a reduced rate. Well, in some cases, and one utility in particular that I'm thinking of, a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more sophisticated than that, saying, you give us the right. You need your charge needs to be to go to a full charge on your vehicle needs to be 4 hours, 6 hours, whatever that happens to be. You give us utility the ability to say which 4 hours that is. We'll make sure when you're going out at 7 o'clock in the morning, your car has a full charge. You just won't know what 4 hours in that 12 hours you were home you were actually charging. Let us decide either based on what the clean energy mix is at that particular time or what the cost is for power to be purchased at that particular time. And in doing that, everybody benefits from that as well.
That's pretty cool.
The driver who plugs in their EV, they get some kind of compensation from the utility for being able to give the utility that kind of control over the charging. But everybody benefits because if the mix is cleaner and it's cheaper, I benefit from that even if I don't have an EV. Yeah. So and the utility is willing to because that's part of their optimization of the grid, they're willing, if it's costing them less to purchase power at a particular time, then they can help pass some of that savings on to the customer, and then they can get the benefit of the rest of that.
That reminds me of a presentation I did quite a few years ago on electrification, that the electrification could actually help lower rate or decrease rates because you're selling more electricity. Basically, you're running the grid at a higher capacity factor or power generation. You're using the assets more. So rather than having such peaky loads, you can use them more. And that's kind of what you were just explaining with that car charging.
Yeah, and as long as you're doing that at times that are beneficial to the grid. Now, if everybody plugs their car in at 4 o'clock, we've got a problem. Sure. Because now we're on peak and there's that much more generation that has to come at that time. And that may be more expensive, and that may be a dirtier mix of generation too. So as long as we're devising the programs, that are, and that's where PBR can come in, because you can devise metrics that say, how much of load did you shift away from peak? How much load was cleaner based on the shifting that you did? What were the cost savings? And allow the utility then to share in that if they're managing the grid, optimally for those control targets. Then you can really have something that can benefit everybody.
Great. So last topic or subtopic. So Illinois was either just signed something or passed something. Can you does that have to do with performance-based rate making? Is that part included? Okay.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that?
So Illinois, on September 15th, the governor signed a bill. It took effect immediately, so it took effect on September 15th. That is a comprehensive clean energy bill and really covers pretty much everything you can think of in terms of clean energy legislation. Part of that, though, is a new rate-making structure for the utilities. They've been under something called a formula rate for the last 10 years, where their return on equity is set by a formula, and then they get whatever they spend ends up being compensated then at that rate of return. Illinois went back to what's more of a traditional rate making, and the utility is allowed to choose, or a multi-year rate making plan. In both cases, there's a whole what they call integrated distribution planning that has to be done. So the commissioners and the public get to see what are the investments that the utilities need to make into the distribution grid. But then part of that system is also in the multi-year rate plan. There is also the ability for the utility. There's certain goals that they're going to have to meet, certain investments they're going to have to make. There's a shared savings provision in there where if they're able to accomplish those goals by utilizing less money, there's a shared savings between the utility and the customers. But then there's also a whole performance-based metric system that will be set up then by the commission. And they're going to go about it the right way. They're going to look and see, first of all, what are we measuring right now? So metrics is not just assigning a monetary value right away. You first need to see what your state goals are. What are the things that we want to achieve? And most of those are set out in the bill itself. Then, what are we measuring right now? What are those metrics showing us? What are the things we want to measure? What are the targets for those? And then you decide, what dollars should we attach to any of this performance. So that's all really spelled out. The multi-year rate plan in itself is kind of a performance-based scheme.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But then you add on the performance-based metrics or performance incentive mechanism part to that, and you're really going to see Illinois kind of really have a kind of a new rate-making system there that's designed, again, as we talked about earlier, aligning utility, both Ameren and Commonwealth Edison, aligning their performance and the compensation for that performance to other state goals, including decarbonization goals, including interconnection, demand response. Decarbonization itself is not part of that, but a lot of the measures are designed because it's a clean energy bill. A lot of the measures like interconnection of renewables, for example, demand response, shifting some of the things we were talking about earlier, that's designed toward getting toward a cleaner energy mix for the state.
I have a tangent question for you on that for the Illinois law. Does that include, I don't want to say a benefit for nuclear, but maybe that performance-based rate making can benefit nuclear indirectly because it's zero carbon.
Well, the bill itself. So understand, Illinois is one of the states that's been deregulated. So generation is not, like in Minnesota or Wisconsin, the neighbors. Generation is also regulated by the commission. So that interaction of generation with distribution is much more pronounced in those states than it is in Illinois, where just the distribution part is regulated. So
that's all that.
But within the clean energy bill, there is a subsidy for Illinois has the largest nuclear fleet in the country. There's subsidization for 3 of the nuclear plants in this bill. With a proviso that the 4th plant will also stay open for 5 years. Now, what that does is it that's such a substantial portion now of the clean energy. We're defining clean energy here as non-greenhouse gas emitting energy. It's such a substantial part of that keeping those plants online was very important to the governor and to the legislators who voted for the bill, or at least many of them anyway. Yeah. Now, what that does in terms of, as you're talking about clean energy and how that is affected by that, if the nuclear plants are online, the nuclear plants run all of the time. They don't ramp up and ramp down. They can, but
90+%.
For the most part, they don't. So they're there all of the time. So at night, one of the issues has been nuclear plants essentially are running, they're essentially paying to run at night because the cost of power is so low at night, and they don't have the ability to ramp up or ramp down. So that was perceived as a negative. If you're shifting more load to night, that can really help a state like Illinois in terms of their clean energy goals. So things like demand response then and shifting load that you can address through the performance metrics then might also have a benefit for the Illinois nuclear plants and for Illinois customers, the ability to take advantage of lower cost power, cleaner energy from a GHG standpoint. So theoretically, you could benefit all of the customers that are in the PJM portion, the Commonwealth Edison portion of Illinois. So the two things, while not directly linked, certainly will play off of each other.
Okay. Cool. So last thing, what do you think? What do you think of performance-based rate making? What do you think of its future? Is it, what's it looking like for other states?
I think you're going to see a lot more states start to take advantage of that. The process in Minnesota has taken quite a long time. The one in Illinois will take some time to to kind of.
So the Minnesota has some of the elements. That
Oh yeah, a
Minnesota
lot
has.
of the same things that we talked about
Okay.
in terms of understanding what you're measuring, what the goals are,
Mhm.
and then you need a process to reevaluate too, because maybe we've started measuring something that really doesn't matter as much to us as we thought it did originally, or
Oh, yeah.
maybe attaching this financial benefit or risk to the utility creates some unintended consequence we hadn't thought of. So you need an ability to reevaluate at all times. But I think in terms of more and more states that are going to do that, I think that's absolutely going to happen because
Oh. Mm.
we've gotten past that point, I think, for a lot of states, excuse me, where the commissions are they're always going to be interested in reliability and affordability. That's always going to be there, and they're always going to
That's
be
what I
interested
always.
in
What I always hear
customer
is that.
service. So that's just a given. But to the extent that commissions can then work with the utilities to try to achieve other goals states have, is going to lend itself to looking at performance-based rate making, as something in the future. Whether you can keep the traditional cost of service and do a little bit of performance-based rate making around the edges, do some
Mhm.
things on reliability, do some things on customer service, maybe you do some things on demand response or interconnection, or you can do what Hawaii's done and what New York is doing, and really devise a kind of performance based rate making where that's the core of it. Or you could do
Mhm.
something in between. One
Okay.
state
Yeah.
was looking at a system where they might take whatever the return on equity for the utility was in a rate case and back that down a little bit, give a haircut to the utility,
Yep.
and then allow them to earn back through performance metrics. That's a different way that you can look at that. So there's lots of different ways that I think states are going to do that, and they'll pick out different metrics and they'll pick out different goals, and that's fine because no two utilities are alike anywhere in the
Sure.
country. Even
Yep. Or
even in the
states.
same state, utilities are going to react very differently to the different proposals that are out there, and the issues that they have in their footprint for each individual utility is going to differ from the utility next door. So allowing, and like, for example, in Illinois, the metrics that will end up being assigned to Commonwealth Edison's footprint don't necessarily have to be the same metrics that are assigned to Ameren's footprint.
Okay.
They might have the
Yep.
same goals, but the measurements might be different. There might be a metric that's in ComEd that's not in Ameren, and vice versa.
The load.
So,
Yeah.
and I think that's going to be necessary as states start looking at this.
Yeah. Their load shapes will probably look a lot, significantly different, possibly.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Well, this has been great. This is the best news I've heard in a while. This is pretty exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Because
it's good. And as more states start to look at, doing legislation like Illinois was, and other states have been doing that, obviously the rate making issues, whether it's in California or New York or other places, the rate making issues become really, really important to
yeah,
trying to hit their other goals. So yeah,
awesome. Well, keep up the great work.
thanks.
This
Great
is
talking to you.
It's very, very exciting.